The wind that scours the high Anatolian plateau carries the scent of dry grass, sun-baked stone, and something older, an echo of hooves that once shook the earth. If you stand at dusk on the crest above the village of Surgut, the valley below pools with violet shadow, and the hills seem to roll outward like the backs of sleeping beasts. It was here, in the last decades of the 13th century, that a Turkic chieftain of obscure lineage watched the horizon for the glow of Byzantine campfires. His name was Osman, a name that would become a dynasty, a state, and finally an empire so vast that for 6 centuries its shadow fell across 3 continents. Yet on the night we begin, he commanded nothing more than a few hundred felt tents, a handful of horses, and the restless ambition that had carried his people out of the Central Asian steppe 1,000 years earlier. Osman's tribe were Ghazi, frontier warriors who lived for plunder and for paradise, who believed that every sword thrust into the ribs of a Christian infidel was a coin dropped into the purse of their salvation. They had drifted westward with the slow tide of the Seljuk collapse, riding through the wound the Mongols had torn across the Islamic world. When the last Seljuk Sultan of Rum died without an heir, the plateau fragmented into beyliks, small emirates clawing at one another for pasture land, salt routes, and the right to tax the caravans that still dared the Silk Road. Osman's inheritance was the smallest, poorest of these beyliks, wedged between the stagnant Byzantine frontier and the jealous, stronger tribes. But Osman possessed something his rivals lacked: patience, and a gift for reading the desperation of others. He married Sheikh Edibali's daughter, an old dervish whose dream of a moon rising from Sheikh's breast and settling in Osman's became the first prophecy of empire. The marriage brought him not only legitimacy among wandering dervishes, but access to their networks of cloisters, caravanserais, and whispered intelligence that stretched from Bursa to Baghdad. Thus, when the Byzantine governor of Bilesik rode out to collect winter taxes, he found his path blocked by Osman's cavalry in the pass of Karacahisar. The skirmish lasted less than an hour. The consequences would endure 600 years. By 1302, Osman's warriors, now calling themselves Osmanli, Ottomans, had taken the fortresses of Yenishehir and Lefk. Each conquest followed the same rhythm: a night march, a torch lit atop a minaret inside the walls by a Muslim prisoner promised freedom, gates yawning open at dawn, and then the low chant of the first Friday prayer in the conquered church. Osman did not raise the towns. He needed their artisans, their mills, their grape arbors. He left the Greek priests in place, merely adding a crescent to the cross on the altar and a new line in the tax ledger. The Byzantine Empire, shrunk to a ribbon of land around Constantinople, could spare no more armies for the interior. Emperor Andronikos Roman II hired Catalan mercenaries instead, hard men from Aragon who arrived with crossbows and a taste for land they could never hold. When the Catalans mutinied over unpaid wages, they burned the crops that might have fed a Byzantine relief force. Osman watched from a distance, learning that an empire can die as much from its own ledger books as from the sword. In 1326, as Osman lay dying in his felt tent, he pressed his son Orhan to take Bursa, the walled city that guarded the approaches to Constantinople. Tradition says Osman's last words were, "Bursa is the key. When it falls, the door to Europe swings open." Orhan rode at dawn, and by spring Bursa's honey-colored walls were draped with green banners. The Ottomans converted the cathedral of Hagios Ions into the first imperial mosque, but Orhan went further. He invited Persian scholars to reopen the shuttered academy, commissioned a public hospital where Jewish physicians treated Christian merchants, and minted silver acts so pure that Italian traders accepted them at par with Venetian ducats. Bursa became the first Ottoman capital, its silk bazaars perfumed with musk from Tabriz, its gardens planted with the first tulips the plateau had ever seen. Yet Orhan's eyes already looked west. Across the Dardanelles, Europe lay divided, Byzantium racked by civil war, Serbia exhausted by clashes with Hungary, Bulgaria crumbling under Mongol taxes. Orhan hired Genos galleys and ferried 2,000 infantry across the Narrows at Gallipoli. The year was 1354. Europe did not yet know that it had been invaded, not by an army, but by an idea. The idea that the Mediterranean could be an Ottoman lake. Orhan's son, Murad, inherited a state that was no longer a tribe, but not yet an empire. He wore silk robes stitched with Persian couplets, yet still mounted his horse by leaping from the ground, an old nomad test of legitimacy. At the Battle of Kosovo in 1389, Murad confronted Lazar Hrebeljanović's Serbian-led coalition on the field of blackbirds. The morning mist clung so low that the two armies advanced like shadows merging. Murad was killed by a Serbian noble who feigned surrender and stabbed him in the groin. Yet Murad's son Bayezid, watching from a nearby hill, did not pause. He ordered his heavy cavalry, Sepahis clad in plates of mirror-bright steel, to charge before the Serbs could realize the Sultan was dead. The tide turned. Lazar was captured and beheaded. By dusk, Serbian knights lay heaped around Murad's tent, their peacock feathers soaked in blood, and Bayezid rode among them proclaiming himself Sultan-i-Rum, Sultan of Rome. Europe shuddered. The heir of Caesar now knelt to a Muslim prince. Bayezid earned the epithet Yildirim, Thunderbolt, for the speed of his retribution and the terror of his whims. Within a decade, he had annexed Bulgaria, reduced Byzantium to the walls of Constantinople, and forced Manuel Roman II Paleologos to stand beside him at court, holding the Sultan's stirrup while he mounted. But Bayezid's ambition outran Ottoman logistics. When Timur, Tamerlane, marched west from Samarkand with an army that included war elephants and Persian engineers who could cast bronze cannon in the field, Bayezid raced east to meet him. At Ankara, in 1402, the two crescents faced each other across a plain of yellow grass. Timur had seeded the battlefield with spikes hidden in straw. When the Ottoman cavalry charged, their horses foundered. Worse, Timur had suborned the Tartar auxiliaries in Bayezid's own army. They defected mid-battle, howling the same steppe songs their grandfathers had sung on the Central Asian prairie. Bayezid was captured, placed in an iron cage, and paraded through Timur's camp while flute girls danced before him. He died 7 months later, reportedly smashing his head against the bars. The Ottoman state fractured. Bayezid's sons fought a decade-long civil war that reduced Anatolia to a wasteland of burned caravanserais and ruined aqueducts. Europeans breathed relief. The shadow had lifted. Yet the Ottomans had learned the most important lesson an empire can learn: how to survive defeat. When Mehmed Celebi emerged victorious in 1413, he did not repeat his father's hubris. He executed only one brother, blinded the rest, and then invited the scholars who had fled Timur's devastation to resettle in Bursa and Edirne. He lowered taxes on Christian villages that surrendered without siege and issued the first canon name. Sultanic law codes that existed alongside Islamic Sharia, but dealt with land tenure, coinage, and market inspection. The state became a tripod: the Sultan's household, the Islamic ulama, and the slave soldiers of the port, the Janissaries. The Janissaries were Christian boys taken in the Devshirme levy, converted, taught Persian, Arabic, and the art of war, and sworn to celibacy and absolute obedience. They wore white felt bonnets shaped like inverted cups and marched to the shrill of the zurna. By 1450, they numbered 12,000, an army that belonged to no tribe, no province, only to the Sultan. Europe had created its own antithesis, a Christian host reforged into Islam's blade. Maimed Roman II, Maimed the Conqueror, was 21 when he rode to the shores of the Bosporus and stared at Constantinople's walls. They rose 30 feet high, layered of brick and limestone bonded with marble dust, their crenellations gnawed by 1,000 years of wind, but still defiant. Behind them, the last Byzantine emperor, Constantine Roman XI Palaiologos, possessed barely 5,000 defenders and a treasury that could not pay them. Maimed, by contrast, had 70,000 men, a corps of Hungarian engineers who could cast bronze cannon that hurled 600-pound balls, and a fleet dragged overland on oiled logs from the Bosporus to the Golden Horn, bypassing the great chain that blocked the harbor. For 55 days in spring 1453, the world held its breath. Cannonballs screamed across the water, shattering ancient masonry. Greek fire sputtered against the sides of Ottoman galleys. Miners dug tunnels beneath the walls, only to meet Serbian sappers hired by the Byzantines who countermined with barrels of Greek fire and deafening explosions of gunpowder. On the final night, Constantine walked the ramparts in full armor, offering the last coins in the imperial treasury to any man who would stand one more hour. At dawn on May 29, the first wave of Bashi Bazauks, irregulars promised the right to plunder, crashed against the walls and were cut down. The second wave, Anatolian infantry, faltered. Maimed then unleashed the Janissaries. They advanced beneath overlapping shields, muskets crackling, until a cannonball breached the Kirkaporta gate. Janissaries poured through, climbed the inner wall, and raised the Sultan's standard atop the tower. Constantine died in the crush, his body never identified. Legend says the moon eclipsed as the city fell. More certain is that Hagia Sophia's great doors were battered open, and when Maimed rode inside, he dismounted, scattered a handful of soil over the marble floor, and commanded the imam to mount the pulpit. The cathedral's mosaics, gold leaf and lapis lazuli depicting Christ Pantocrator, were whitewashed, but the Sultan spared the congregation in exchange for their treasure. Constantinople became Istanbul, Islambal, the city of Islam, and the Ottoman Empire acquired a capital whose very name meant, to half the world, the center of the earth. The conqueror did not stop at the Bosporus. He turned north, subjugating the Genos colonies of the Black Sea, then west, marching through Serbia and Bosnia. At the Battle of Varna in 1444, a crusader army led by the young King W. Ladislaw of Hungary and Poland was shattered when the king himself, charging at the head of 500 Polish knights, was unhorsed and beheaded. His head, stuffed with straw, was sent to Istanbul and displayed on a pike beside the hippodrome. Maimed then turned south, conquering the empire of Trebizond and the Crimean Khanate, reducing the Black Sea to an Ottoman lake. Yet his most enduring conquest was bureaucratic. He codified the Timur system, land grants to cavalrymen in exchange for military service, creating a feudal cavalry that could be mobilized within weeks. He commissioned the first Ottoman census, recording every village, every head of sheep, every able-bodied male. And he ordered the construction of Topkapi Palace, a labyrinth of courtyards and pavilions where the Sultan lived behind the Gate of Felicity, visible only to the eunuchs and the pages of the inner service. The palace became a city within a city, its kitchens capable of roasting an entire camel stuffed with sheep stuffed with chickens stuffed with quinces. More importantly, it became the stage upon which the Sultan performed the ritual of power. Each morning, Grand Viziers kissed the hem of his robe. Each evening, the chief black eunuch chose which concubine would share the royal bed. The empire was no longer a tribe on horseback. It was a machine that converted land into gold, gold into armies, armies into more land. When Mehmet died in 1481, poisoned, some say, by a Jewish physician who feared the Sultan's plans to conquer Rome, his son Bayezid Roman II inherited a realm stretching from the Danube to the Euphrates. Bayezid was cautious where his father had been relentless. He refused Columbus's proposal to reach Asia by sailing west, an offer the Sultan dismissed as fantasy, and instead consolidated the fleet Mehmet had begun. At the naval arsenal of Gallipoli, Ottoman shipwrights learned to frame hulls with oak ribs so sturdy that their galleys could mount cannon on the forecastle, transforming naval warfare from ram and burn to broadside and blast. Bayezid's reign saw the first Ottoman voyages to India, the first Ottoman atlas, drawn by the corsair-turned-admiral Piri Reis, and the first Ottoman law regulating the price of coffee, newly arrived from Yemen. Coffee houses sprouted in Istanbul like mushrooms after rain, their low ceilings thick with smoke and conspiracy. The ulama complained that men discussed poetry and politics with equal irreverence. Bayezid replied that a quiet populace was preferable to a sober one. Yet Bayezid could not escape the dynastic curse. His brother Selim, governor of Karaman, rebelled and fled to the Knights of Rhodes, who shipped him to Rome. Pope Innocent Roman VIII kept Selim as a hostage, threatening to release him whenever the Sultan seemed restive. Bayezid paid 45,000 ducats a year to keep his brother caged, a sum that financed the Vatican's new Sistine Chapel. The Ottomans had learned that diplomacy could be more expensive than war. Selim the Grim, Yavuz, ended the era of caution. He began his reign in 1512 by executing all male relatives except his infant son, Suleiman, thus instituting fratricide as law. For the sake of the world's order, whichever of my sons wins the throne, let him kill his brothers. Selim then turned east, where the Safavid Shah Ismail had welded Persia into a sheer theocracy and was inciting Anatolian tribes to revolt. At Saldaran in 1514, Selim's janissaries faced Safavid cavalry armed with sabers and faith. The Ottomans deployed camel-mounted artillery. The Safavid horses, terrified by the scent, bolted. Ismail fled barefoot, leaving his treasury and his wives. Selim sent the captured Persian princesses to Istanbul's bazaars as slaves, but kept Ismail's favorite wife for himself, a slight that rankled the Shah until his death. Selim then marched south, defeating the Mamluk Sultanate, heirs of the slave soldiers who had ruled Egypt and Syria for 3 centuries, at Marj Dabik and Ridania. Cairo fell. The last Abbasid caliph, Al-Mutawakkil Roman III, was carried to Istanbul in a cage, symbolically transferring the caliphate to the Ottomans. When Selim died in 1520, he left Suleiman an empire that stretched from Algeria to the Persian Gulf, from the Danube to the Upper Nile. The Mediterranean was becoming an Ottoman lake. Suleiman the Magnificent, Kanuni, the lawgiver, ascended the throne at 26, tall, slender, with a turban crested by a four-tiered aigrette of diamonds. He spoke Persian, Arabic, and Serbian, composed couplets under the pen name Muhibi, lover, and rode at the head of an army that numbered 200,000. In 1521, he besieged Belgrade, the key to Hungary. The city's walls, reinforced by the Knights of Rhodes, held for 3 weeks until a Serbian miner defected, revealing a culvert beneath the bastions. Janissaries crawled through the sewer and emerged in the cathedral square. The garrison surrendered. Suleiman spared the civilians but resettled 2,000 Serbian families to Istanbul, where their descendants still live today. 2 years later, he turned Rhodes, the last Christian stronghold in the eastern Mediterranean. The siege lasted 6 months. The knights, commanded by Philippe Villiers de l'Isle Adam, fought from behind bastions newly fortified with Italian engineering. Suleiman's cannonballs bounced off. His miners dug tunnels that collapsed under counter-mines packed with gunpowder. In the end, the knights negotiated surrender in exchange for safe passage to Malta. Suleiman, admiring their valor, provided ships and provisions. When Villiers knelt to kiss the Sultan's hand, Suleiman raised him up and said, "It is not the custom of my house to humiliate brave foes." The Mediterranean was now Ottoman. In 1526, Suleiman marched up the Danube to confront Louis Roman II of Hungary at Mohacs. The Hungarian knights, clad in plate armor that gleamed like mirrors, charged across a marshy plain and were cut down by Ottoman artillery. Louis fled, his horse stumbled, and he drowned in a stream weighed down by his armor. Suleiman entered Buda, seated himself on the throne of St. Stephen, and ordered the Hungarian crown sent to Istanbul. Hungary was divided. The Habsburgs took the north and west, the Ottomans the south and east, and Transylvania became a vassal principality, paying tribute to both. The frontier would remain fluid for a century, a strip of land where castles changed hands with the seasons, where priests prayed in Latin on Sunday, and the muezzin called from the same tower on Friday. Suleiman then besieged Vienna in 1529, the high watermark of Ottoman expansion. His army arrived too late in the season. Rain turned the roads to mud, wagon wheels sank to the axles, and the city's walls, newly reinforced by the Habsburg engineer Benedict Ride, withstood cannonades that had shattered Belgrade. After 3 weeks, Suleiman withdrew, leaving behind sacks of coffee beans. The first Viennese tasted coffee and invented the kwasa, crescent-shaped to mark the retreating moon of Islam. Yet Vienna's survival meant the Ottomans had reached the limit of their logistics. The frontier hardened into a line of fortresses, Kanij, Egri, Zajdvar, where Christians and Muslims glared across moats stocked with the same fish. While Suleiman campaigned in Europe, his navy under Hayreddin Barbarossa, red-bearded Khizr Rise, transformed the Mediterranean into an Ottoman chessboard. Barbarossa, born on the island of Lesbos to an Albanian pater and a Greek mother, understood every reef and wind between Algiers and Antalya. He allied with France against the Habsburgs, wintered his fleet in Toulon, and raided the coasts of Italy so thoroughly that the Pope paid him tribute to spare Rome. In 1538, at Preveza, Barbarossa defeated a Holy League fleet twice his size by luring the Christian galleys into a narrow strait where they could not form line of battle. The Venetian commander, Andrea Doria, fled, leaving the sea to the crescent flag. Ottomans garrisoned Tripoli, Tunis, Algiers. European merchant ships paid protection money, and the sea itself became a tax. Suleiman rewarded Barbarossa with the Grand Admiral's standard, an octagonal banner of green silk embroidered with the Shahada in gold, and a palace on the Bosporus where the old corsair died in his bed, a rarity among pirates. Yet the empire's greatest conquest was not of land, but of law. Suleiman spent winters in Istanbul, reviewing the fatwas of the ulama, the canons of his predecessors, and the sultanic decrees that had accumulated like silt. He codified criminal penalties, land tenure, and the rights of non-Muslims into the Canon-i-Osmani, a single legal corpus that remained in force into the 19th century. He reformed the timur system to curb abuses, required governors to submit annual budgets, and established a postal relay of mounted couriers that could carry a decree from Istanbul to Cairo in 12 days. The Sultan also patronized architecture on a scale unseen since Justinian. Mimar Sinan, a Christian boy from Cappadocia taken in the Devshirme, rose to become chief royal architect. Over 50 years, he built 131 mosques, 52 madrasas, 55 bathhouses, and 3 aqueducts. The Suleimani Eye Mosque, crowning the highest hill of Istanbul, is a stone sermon, 4 minarets for the 4 caliphs, 10 balconies for the 10 years of Suleiman's reign when it was begun, a dome higher and wider than Hagia Sophia's proclaiming that Islam had surpassed Christianity in the city where East meets West. Inside, Iznik tiles bloom with tulips and carnations, so vivid that worshippers claim the flowers sway when the imam recites. Sinan, asked which of his works he loved most, replied, "The one that keeps the rain off the poor," and built a bridge at Büyükçekmece so long that the Sultan rode across it without his horse touching water. But even the lawgiver could not legislate mortality. In 1553, Suleiman ordered the execution of his eldest son, Mustafa, strangled with a bowstring in the tent where he waited to greet his father. The charge was treason, fabricated by the Sultan's wife, Hürrem, Roxolana, the Ukrainian slave who had become Suleiman's legal wife, the first concubine to break the Ottoman tradition that sultans marry only slave girls to avoid noble intrigue. Hürrem wanted her own son, Selim, to succeed. European ambassadors whispered that the Sultan had become the slave of his wife. Mustafa's death fractured the dynasty. When Suleiman died in 1566 at the siege of Zajdvar, his tent flooded by autumn rain, his heart removed and buried beneath the Kub where he had prayed, Selim, the Sot, inherited an empire at its zenith. Selim Roman II preferred wine to war, leaving governance to his Albanian Grand Vizier, Sakalu Mehmed Pasha, who governed from a kiosk overlooking the Golden Horn. Sakalu extended Ottoman sway into the Indian Ocean, dispatching a fleet to Aceh in Sumatra, where the Sultan of Aceh pledged tribute, and planned a canal across the Isthmus of Suez 4 centuries before de Lesseps. But Selim's reign also saw the first cracks, inflation triggered by the flood of New World silver, janissaries stationed in Istanbul who demanded cash bonuses each time a new sultan ascended, and provincial governors who treated Timurs as hereditary fiefs. The empire that had expanded by conquest would soon learn to contract. At Lepanto in 1571, the Holy League assembled by Pope Pius V, Spain, Venice, the Knights of Malta, met the Ottoman fleet in the Gulf of Patras. The Christians deployed 6 galleasses, oversized galleys armed with heavy cannon, at the vanguard. Ottoman commanders, confident in their numerical superiority, rode straight into the kill zone. Cannonballs the size of millstones tore through cedar hulls. The sea itself seemed to burn. By evening, 137 Ottoman galleys had been captured or sunk, 30,000 sailors killed, and the Grand Admiral, Ali Pasha, beheaded. European churches rang with thanksgiving. Miguel de Cervantes, wounded in the fight, lost the use of his left hand but gained material for Don Quixote. Yet the victory proved hollow. Sakhalou Mehmed rebuilt the fleet in a single winter, using cedar from the Taurus and iron from Bosnia. When the new armada sailed in 1572, the Holy League had dissolved for lack of funds. Lepanto became a poem rather than a turning point, celebrated in canvases by Titian and verses by G.K. Chesterton, but the sea remained contested. The Ottomans learned that naval power depended less on galleys, manned by slaves chained to benches, than on ocean-capable galleons, a technology they would adopt too late. The long war with Persia resumed under Murad Roman III, who sent 100,000 men east to confront Shah Abbas. The campaigns achieved little but drained the treasury. To pay the troops, the Sultan debased the axe, mixing silver with copper until merchants refused Ottoman coin. Inflation spiraled. Janissaries mutinied when their pay lost half its value. The state responded by selling offices, tax farms, judgeships, even provincial governorships, to the highest bidder. Corruption calcified. A governor of Egypt, appointed for 50,000 gold pieces, recouped his investment by taxing date palms, Nile boats, and the pilgrimage caravan itself. Meanwhile, the frontier in Hungary hardened into a stalemate of sieges and counter-sieges. The Habsburgs built a fortress at Kamarno. The Ottomans countered with one at Kanij. Between them lay a no-man's land where wheat grew head-high and wolves dined on unburied dead. The Sultan, secluded in the harem of Topkapi, where 1,200 concubines competed for the royal glance, delegated power to the Queen Mother, the Valide Sultan. Safi I, mother of maimed Roman III, corresponded with Elizabeth I of England over the heads of their respective ambassadors, discussing joint action against Spain. English merchants, newly incorporated as the Levant Company, traded wool and tin for silk and spices, anchoring at Galata, where the minaret of a Genos church had been crowned with a crescent. Capitalism crept into the empire on the keels of merchantmen, bearing bills of exchange that would erode the timber system more surely than any cannon. Maimed Roman III ended the century by executing his 19 brothers, strangled by deaf mutes to ensure the law of fratricide, and leading an army to Hungary, where he recaptured the fortress of Egri, but died of exhaustion at the age of 37. His son Ahmed I inherited a treasury so empty that he ordered the gold and silver leaf stripped from the Dome of the Rock in Jerusalem to coin money. Yet Ahmed built the Blue Mosque, its interior tiled with 20,000 Iznik panels of lapis and turquoise, across from Hagia Sophia, creating the skyline that still defines Istanbul. He also signed the Peace of Zitvatorok in 1606, the first treaty in which the Ottoman Sultan was recognized as an equal by the Holy Roman Emperor, ending the annual tribute Hungary had paid since Suleiman. The empire had reached its geographical limits. Further conquest would cost more than it yielded. Henceforth, the Ottomans would fight to hold rather than to expand, a subtle but seismic shift that turned warriors into garrison troops, frontier lords into tax collectors, and the empire's story from one of rise to one of managing decline. The 17th century opened like a wound that would not close. In the palace harem, where latticed windows filtered the Bosporus into shards of turquoise light, the Valide Sultan Kursum ruled through her mad son, Mustafa I, and then through her grandson, Murad Roman IV. The empire was no longer steered by sword-wielding sultans on horseback, but by whispered councils behind gilded screens, by eunuchs who carried decrees in their sleeves and poison in their rings. Yet the frontier still bled. In 1606, the same year the ink dried on the Peace of Zitvatorok, a Habsburg spy counted the Ottoman army camped outside Kamarno, 40,000 Janissaries, 20,000 Sipahis, 90,000 Azap conscripts, and noted that half the Janissaries wore European boots, not the white felt of their fathers. The Devshirme had slowed. Muslim-born Turks now bribed their way into the core, diluting the slave-soldier ethic that had forged the empire. The treasury, hollowed by inflation, paid wages in debased acts so light they floated on water. In response, the Janissaries became a hereditary guild, their barracks in Istanbul a city within a city where coffee houses doubled as stock exchanges, and the Sultan's name was mentioned only in curses. Murad Roman IV tried to turn the tide with terror. He banned tobacco, coffee, and wine on pain of death. When a muezzin was caught smoking a clay pipe, the Sultan personally beheaded him in the hippodrome. Murad rode by night in disguise, sword across his saddle, looking for violators. Hundreds were impaled along the road to Edirne. Yet the same Sultan rebuilt the road itself with stone bridges and caravanserais, and led 200,000 men to recapture Baghdad from the Safavids in 1638. The city fell after a 40-day siege. Murad entered through the Gate of Talisman, planted the Sultan's standard on the tomb of Abu Hanifa, and accepted the keys from a Safavid prince who had already fled. To celebrate, he ordered every 10th Persian soldier beheaded, the skulls stacked into pyramids beside the Tigris. But when he returned to Istanbul, he coughed blood into a silk handkerchief and died at 27, the last sultan to lead an army in person until the 19th century. The empire had become too large for its ruler to wield a sword. Henceforth, victory would depend on grand viziers, provincial governors, and the slow grind of logistics. The Köprülü era began with a single appointment in 1656. Named Köprülü, an Albanian shepherd's son who had risen through the palace kitchens to become governor of Tripoli, was summoned to the divan at the age of 70. The Venetian navy had blockaded the Dardanelles. The treasury could not pay the Janissaries, and the Sultan, named Roman IV, preferred hunting to governance. Köprülü demanded absolute power for 5 years, the heads of any who opposed him, and a purse of gold to bribe the troops. Granted all 3, he began by executing 4,000 corrupt officials in a single month, their bodies flung into the Bosporus, where sharks learned to follow the royal barges. He rebuilt the navy with timber from the Danube Delta, copper from Kastamonu, and sailors pressed from every fishing village between Gallipoli and Sinope. At the Battle of the Dardanelles in 1657, the new fleet shattered the Venetian blockade. Within 2 years, Ottoman galleys were raiding the lagoons of Venice itself. Köprülü then turned north, defeating a Habsburg army at the Battle of St. Gotthard and forcing the Treaty of Vassvar, which extended the peace for 20 years. When he died in 1661, his son Fazil Ahmed inherited the seals of office, becoming the first Grand Vizier to succeed his father without a coup. The Köprülüs ruled for half a century, restoring central authority, rebalancing the budget, and postponing the empire's fall long enough for it to dream of greatness once more. Under Fazil Ahmed, the army marched again. In 1663, 100,000 men crossed the Danube and besieged the Habsburg fortress of Nowe Zamki. The siege failed, but the following year, at the Battle of St. Gotthard, the Ottomans routed the Habsburg cavalry, their Sipahis wheeling in perfect crescent formations that reminded European observers of a silver moon slicing through clouds. The treaty that followed ceded Nowe Zamki to the Ottomans and confirmed their control of Transylvania. Yet the real prize lay east. The Safavid Empire, exhausted by civil war and Afghan revolts, collapsed when Shah Suleiman abdicated in favor of a Sufi mystic. In 1676, Kara Mustafa, son-in-law of the Kerprulus, led 200,000 men through the snows of the Caucasus and recaptured Yerevan, Tiflis, and Tabriz. The Safavid capital, Isfahan, sent carpets and gold to sue for peace. The Ottomans accepted, but kept the Caucasus. The empire now stretched from the Adriatic to the Caspian, the largest contiguous realm since the Mongols. Kara Mustafa rode into Istanbul, beneath a rain of carnations thrown by Jewish and Armenian merchants whose caravans could now travel from Belgrade to Bukhara under a single flag. Emboldened, Kara Mustafa turned west once more. In 1683, he led 140,000 men, Tartar scouts, Serbian infantry, Wallachian cavalry, and the elite Janissaries, up the Danube toward Vienna. The city, seat of the Habsburg Emperor Leopold I, was defended by only 15,000 troops under Count Ernst Rudiger von Starhemberg. Kara Mustafa bypassed the fortress of Jaya, hoping to take Vienna by surprise, but the Habsburgs had learned Ottoman tactics. They burned the countryside, poisoned wells, and herded livestock behind the city walls. Vienna's defenses had been modernized by Italian engineers, 11 bastions connected by earthworks angled to deflect artillery, a wide glacis cleared of cover, and a new ravelin before the Burgbaste. Kara Mustafa arrived on July 14, 1683, and began the siege that would decide the fate of Europe. For 2 months, the city endured. Ottoman sappers dug tunnels beneath the bastions, filling them with barrels of gunpowder. The Viennese countermined, listening for the scrape of shovels in the dark. When a mine exploded, Janissaries surged through the breach, only to meet pikemen and citizens hurling rocks from the rubble. Kara Mustafa refused offers of surrender, determined to take the city by storm and plunder it for 3 days, as Constantinople had been plundered. But fate had other plans. On September 12, a relief army of 70,000, Poles under Jan Sobieski, Germans under Charles of Lorraine, and Bavarians under Maximilian Emanuel, descended from the Kahlenberg Heights. At dawn, Sobieski's heavy cavalry, 20,000 winged hussars with feathers like avenging angels, charged downhill. The Ottoman lines buckled, then broke. Kara Mustafa fled, leaving behind 10,000 dead, 300 cannon, and the Sultan's sacred standard, captured by a Polish Koresi. Vienna survived. Europe exhaled. The siege became legend, kwasa shaped like the Ottoman crescent, coffee beans abandoned in the camp, and the first cafe in Vienna opened by a Pole named Jerzy Kulczycki. More importantly, the Ottoman retreat marked the psychological turning point. The empire that had advanced for 3 centuries began to withdraw. The Holy League, Venice, Poland, the papacy, and the Habsburgs pursued. At the Battle of Mohacs in 1687, the Ottomans were routed again. The Sultan, Mehmed Roman IV, was deposed by the Janissaries and locked in a cage. His successor, Suleiman Roman II, signed the Treaty of Karlowitz in 1699, ceding Hungary, Transylvania, and Podolia to the Habsburgs, the Mora to Venice, and Azov to Russia. For the first time, the Ottomans surrendered territory by treaty rather than by temporary defeat. The frontier rolled back like a tide, leaving exposed the empire's internal contradictions. Tax farms sold to the highest bidder, janissaries who married and opened shops, provincial governors who minted their own coins. The Köprülü line ended when the last Grand Vizier, Amkazade Hüseyin, died in 1702. The palace returned to the rule of women and eunuchs. The 18th century dawned under the Tulip Age. Sultan Ahmed Roman III, a poet who composed verses comparing his Grand Vizier's eyebrows to the wings of a nightingale, imported bulbs from the Netherlands. Istanbul's gardens exploded into color, scarlet, violet, and a new shade called blood of the infidel. The first Ottoman printing press, operated by Ibrahim Mutafarrika, a Transylvanian convert, rolled off 17,000 volumes in 30 years, though the ulama restricted it to non-religious works. The first fire brigade, uniformed in crimson and gold, paraded through streets still lit by oil lamps. European ambassadors presented mechanical clocks that played Ottoman marches. The Sultan reciprocated with boxes of attar of roses. But the Tulip Age was financed by deficit spending. When the Persian War resumed in 1723, the treasury borrowed at 30% interest from Galata bankers, Armenian, Greek, and Jewish, who began to dictate policy. In 1730, a Janissary revolt led by Patrona Halil, an Albanian fruit seller, overthrew Ahmed Roman III, dragged his Grand Vizier through the streets, and installed Mahmud I. The tulips were trampled beneath nailed boots. The age of reform had begun, but it would be forced upon the empire by defeats, not by gardens. Mahmud I turned to Europe for salvation. He invited the Count de Barneville to reorganize the Bombardier Corps, imported Prussian officers to drill new regiments, and sent the first permanent embassy to Paris in 1721. The embassy's report, the Sephiroth name, described France as a land where the king eats from porcelain made in Sevres, yet his peasants starve in silk shoes. The observation was prophetic. The Ottomans would modernize by importing European techniques while clinging to Islamic legitimacy, a contradiction that would haunt every reform. Meanwhile, Russia emerged as the northern threat. Peter the Great captured Azov in 1696, gaining access to the Black Sea. Catherine Roman II would push deeper. In 1768, the Ottoman fleet burned at Chesma, trapped in the bay by a Russian fire ship attack. The blaze was visible from Chios, where villagers sang hymns, unsure whether the flames heralded apocalypse or liberation. The Treaty of Kusuk-Kaynarca in 1774 forced the Sultan to recognize the independence of the Crimean Khanate, Muslims ruled by a Christian power, and granted Russia the right to protect Orthodox Christians in the Ottoman lands. The Ottoman Empire became, in diplomatic language, the sick man of Europe, a phrase coined by Tsar Nicholas I a century later, but already felt in the humiliation of Kaynarca. Selim Roman III, ascending the throne in 1789, the year France erupted in revolution, believed the empire could be cured by surgery. He created the Nizam, letter 131 Sedid, the new order, European-style infantry trained in French tactics, wearing blue wool uniforms and crested helmets, drilled on the parade ground of Levend Siftligi. He founded the first Ottoman engineering school, imported French instructors, and sent students to Paris to learn cartography and ballistics. But the Janissaries saw the new order as a threat to their privileges. In 1807, they stormed the palace, killed the reformist ministers, and forced Selim to abdicate. His cousin Mustafa Roman IV ruled for a year, before being overthrown by Alemdar Mustafa, a provincial governor who marched on Istanbul with 15,000 men to restore Selim, only to find the deposed sultan already strangled. Reform had claimed its first royal victim. It would not be the last. The 19th century arrived not with the trumpet of new conquests, but with the slow creak of a siege tower being pushed in reverse. Every plank a province lost, every wheel turn a concession signed. In 1808, the year Mahmud Roman II ascended the throne, the Ottoman Empire still stretched from Algiers to the Caspian, but its sinews had been cut at Seshmi, at Kaynarca, and now at the palace gate itself. The Janissaries who had murdered Selim Roman III swaggered through the streets of Istanbul in scarlet robes, their muskets inlaid with mother-of-pearl, their beards dyed henna red in defiance of grey age and grey authority. They were no longer slave soldiers, but a hereditary guild that owned shops, married, and enrolled their sons without the Devshirm's iron lottery. Their barracks at Et Meidani, literally the square of meat where cattle were slaughtered for the palace, had become a parliament of bayonets, able to topple sultans before breakfast. Mahmud, 23, thin-shouldered, with eyes that blinked too fast when he was angry, wore the sword of Osman at his waist, but knew the blade was ceremonial. He would spend the next 18 years pretending to be a prisoner of protocol while memorizing every face in every regiment, every imam who preached loyalty to the Shaykhul Islam, every Greek banker who kept the ledger of bribes. When the moment came, he would strike once, and the empire would feel the reverberation from Tunis to Trebizond. The Greek revolt gave him his opening. In 1821, Alexandros Ypsilantes, an aide-de-camp to the Tsar, a boy raised on tales of Pericles and Constantine, crossed the Pruth with a phalanx of Moldavian boyars and raised the blue and white flag at Iasi. His revolt was premature. The peasants stayed in their fields. The Patriarch of Constantinople was hanged from the main gate of his cathedral by order of the Sultan, and Ypsilantes fled to Austria. But further south, in the Peloponnese, Greek clefts who had lived like mountain wolves for generations descended on Turkish garrisons armed with Karyophili flintlocks etched with the motto freedom or death. They took Tripolitsa in September, slaughtering 8,000 Muslim civilians in 3 days. The gutters ran so thick that dogs lapped blood and staggered drunk. European opinion, inflamed by romantic poets who imagined marble columns instead of massacres, demanded intervention. Byron arrived at Missolonghi in 1824, mortgaged his English estates to buy a brigade of Soliot warriors, and died of fever in a damp room overlooking a lagoon where frogs sang like broken bells. His death turned Greece from a rebellion into a crusade. At Navarino in 1827, a combined British-French-Russian fleet destroyed the Ottoman-Egyptian navy in 4 hours. 60 ships burned, their masts falling like a forest of torches. Mahmud watched the glow from the palace terrace and understood that the empire could no longer fight Europe alone. The Janissaries, summoned to crush the Greeks, had marched south, but refused to embark for the Mora unless paid in advance. Their mutiny was the final proof that the old army was obsolete. On the night of 15 June 1826, Mahmud struck. He had secretly raised a new artillery corps, Topsu, trained by French officers at the foundry of Tarfane, their uniforms dark green instead of scarlet, their pay guaranteed by the customs receipts of Smyrna. At dawn, the Sultan appeared before the Janissary barracks, flanked by these new guns, and read a firman abolishing the corps. The Janissaries poured out, firing their jeweled muskets, but the artillery had loaded grapeshot. The square became an abattoir. 4,000 Janissaries died in an hour, their blood mixing with the offal of the morning's slaughter. The survivors were hunted through the streets, some sought sanctuary in mosques, only to be dragged out and beheaded. By sunset, the corps that had conquered Constantinople ceased to exist. Mahmud ordered the barracks razed, the ground sown with salt, and a new parade ground, Seraskalik, laid out for the Manjur army, the victorious soldiers of Muhammad. The Devshirme was revived in spirit if not in name. Muslim conscripts now served alongside Christian-born officers trained in Paris and Vienna. The empire had amputated its own limb to save the body. The phantom pain would last a century. Reform accelerated like a runaway carriage. Mahmud shaved his beard, donned a frock coat with epaulets, and appeared at the Sublime Porte in a fez imported from Tunis, headgear that, lacking brim or turban, signaled equality before the law regardless of sect. He opened medical schools where anatomy was taught on cadavers smuggled from European cemeteries, founded a translation office where young bureaucrats rendered Montesquieu into Ottoman Turkish, and sent the first diplomatic mission to London bearing gifts of thoroughbred Arabs and Persian carpets so fine they could be drawn through a signet ring. The ambassadors reported back on steamships, railways, and the strange English custom of allowing newspapers to criticize the monarch. At home, Mahmud replaced provincial governors, previously tax farmers for life, with salaried officials rotated every 3 years, and created the first census since Suleiman, sending clerks into mountain villages where they were met with muskets, and the conviction that counting men was a prelude to conscription. Resistance smoldered in Bosnia. Janissary veterans who had escaped the purge formed the Society of the Faithful, swearing to die in turbans rather than fezes. In Albania, mountain clans declared that no census taker would cross the Valbona alive. The Sultan answered with a new telegraph line, copper wire strung from Istanbul to Edirne, so that imperial orders could outrun the courier's horse. The wires hummed with electricity, and the promise that distance would no longer protect the rebellious. But Europe would not wait. In 1830, France invaded Algiers, ostensibly to punish the Dey for slapping a consul with a fly whisk, in reality to plant the tricolour where Barbary pirates had once raided Toulon. The Ottoman governor, Hüseyin Dey, sent a courier to Istanbul begging aid. Mahmud could spare no fleet, no army, only a firman appointing a new governor who never arrived. Algiers fell, followed by Oran and Constantine. Within 15 years, 100,000 French settlers had carved vineyards from the Tel Atlas. The empire's first loss of Muslim soil to a Christian power was absorbed with the numbness of a patient discovering gangrene in a toe he can no longer feel. Worse followed. In 1831, Mehmed Ali, the Albanian adventurer who had risen to govern Egypt on the back of his massacre of the Mamluks, demanded Syria as reward for helping crush the Greek revolt. Denied, he sent his son Ibrahim Pasha at the head of an army trained by French officers, equipped with conscription, rifled muskets, and a medical corps that inoculated against smallpox. They swept through Syria, defeated an Ottoman army at Konya, and marched within 150 miles of Istanbul. The Sultan's new troops broke and ran. Mahmud, dying of tuberculosis, offered Ibrahim the hereditary governorship of Syria and Arabia if he would withdraw. Only the intervention of Britain, Austria, and Russia, fearful of a French client state athwart the route to India, forced Mehmed Ali back to Egypt. The price was the Convention of 1841, Egypt remained nominally Ottoman but hereditary in Mehmed Ali's line, and the straits, the Bosporus and Dardanelles, were closed to foreign warships in peacetime, a clause that pleased Russia, which wanted no British fleet in the Black Sea, and humiliated the Porte, which could no longer invite allies to defend its capital. The sick man was being dismembered by surgeons who argued over which limb to sever next. Mamluk died on 1 July 1839, his lungs hemorrhaging in a palace room whose windows looked out on the Bosporus, where Russian and British frigates now rode at anchor, their presence a guarantee of the Sultan's impotence. His 16-year-old son, Abdülmecid, inherited a throne propped up by foreign loans, signed at 8% interest, payable in Egyptian cotton and Balkan wheat, and a rescript already drafted by the reformist Grand Vizier Mustafa Rashid Pasha. On 3 November 1839, beneath the grey dome of Gülhane Park, the new Sultan read the Imperial rescript. The Tanzimat had begun. The decree promised security of life, honor, and property to all subjects regardless of religion, equitable conscription, and a regular system of taxation assessed by census, not by the auction block. Non-Muslims, Greeks, Armenians, Jews, were to serve in the army, sit on municipal councils, and wear whatever headgear they chose. The ulama protested that equality before the law contradicted the Pact of Yuma. European ambassadors toasted with champagne. For the first time, the empire defined itself not as the domain of Islam, but as a state whose legitimacy rested on justice measurable by ledgers. The irony was not lost on the crowd. The decree was read in Turkish, translated into French, and distributed in Armenian script to ensure that every millet understood its liberation in a language its leaders could read. The Tanzimat unfolded like a scroll written in disappearing ink. New courts were established, Nizamiye, where judges wore black robes and powdered wigs, quoting both the Quran and the Napoleonic Code. A cadastral survey mapped every field in the Balkans, its French-trained engineers accompanied by gendarmes who shot at villagers hiding grain in haystacks. The first Ottoman railway, financed by British capital, steamed from Izmir to Aydin in 1856, its carriages divided into first class, European merchants, second Ottoman officials, and third sheep, chickens, and peasants. Steamships of the Ottoman Steam Navigation Company, white hulls with red crescents, plied the Mediterranean, competing with Lloyd's of London. Postal stamps bearing the Sultan's Tugra appeared in 1863. Collectors in Paris paid premiums for misprints where the crescent resembled a cross. Conscription, now theoretically universal, still allowed non-Muslims to buy exemption for 50 gold liras, creating a pool of Muslim peasant soldiers who marched to the tune of La Marseillaise, played by military bands in fezzes. The army's new uniforms, dark blue with red piping, were tailored in Manchester, shipped to Alexandria, and carried overland by camel, a global supply chain for a realm that had once clothed itself in silk woven in Bursa. But reform could not outrun revolt. In 1853, Tsar Nicholas, I demanded protectorate rights over all Orthodox Christians in the empire, a claim rooted in the Treaty of Kusuk-Kaynarka. The Sultan, backed by Britain and France, refused. The Crimean War erupted, the first industrial conflict, fought with rifled muskets, telegraph dispatches, and Florence Nightingale's hospital at Scutari, where more men died of cholera than of wounds. The Allies besieged Sevastopol for 11 months. The Ottomans, for once, fought alongside Christians against the Orthodox Tsar. When peace came in 1856, the empire was admitted to the concert of Europe, its sovereignty guaranteed by the great powers, an invitation to the ball, but as the invalid whose cough everyone pretends not to hear. The war cost 400,000 lives and £4 million, borrowed from London banks at usurious rates. To service the debt, the Porte sold the customs receipts of Smyrna, the salt monopoly of Egypt, and the tobacco revenues of Macedonia to European syndicates. Foreign creditors appointed their own collectors. Greek merchants in Galata spoke French to English bankers, while Turkish peasants paid interest in wheat. The empire had become a mortgaged manor whose tenants spoke the language of the mortgage holder. The Balkans answered with nationalism fired by print and priest. In Serbia, Prince Mihailo Obrenović proclaimed autonomy in 1860, his constitution printed in Cyrillic on a press smuggled from Vienna. In Bulgaria, the massacre of 30,000 civilians by irregular Bashi Bazouks in 1876, reported by American journalist Januarius Mac Gahan, shocked European opinion. Disraeli's government fell, and Gladstone thundered that the Turks must go bag and baggage. In Bosnia, Orthodox peasants rose against Muslim landlords, burning manor houses and impaling stewards on stakes soaked in plum brandy. The great powers met at Berlin in 1878 to carve the map. Serbia, Montenegro, and Romania became independent. Bulgaria an autonomous principality, Bosnia occupied by Austria-Hungary, Cyprus leased to Britain. The Sultan, Abdulhamid Roman II, who had come to the throne promising to modernize, watched his European provinces vanish like snow in April. He would spend the next 30 years trying to hold what remained by a mixture of surveillance, censorship, and the first mass-produced ideology the empire ever produced, pan-Islamism. Abdulhamid's Istanbul became a city of listening walls. Plain-clothes policemen, zaptii, patrolled coffee houses, noting who read the Paris newspapers smuggled in the false bottoms of Greek steamer trunks. The telegraph, once the tool of reform, now carried reports of loyalty to the palace secretariat. Every provincial governor received a daily cipher. The shadow of the caliphate is long, ensure no cloud obscures it. The Sultan himself rarely appeared in public. Europeans joked that he reigned from a railway carriage, traveling between Yildiz Palace and the Suragan in a velvet-lined coach, whose windows were curtained so that subjects could not glimpse the caliph's face. Yet behind the curtains, Abdulhamid built schools, 5,000 across the empire, where boys learned arithmetic alongside Quran, and teachers wore European frock coats but pinned verses from the Hadith to their lapels. He sent military cadets to Berlin and Kassel, where they drilled under Prussian officers and returned home dreaming of both Krupp cannon and constitutional liberty. The first Ottoman chemistry laboratory opened in 1883. Its students distilled ether and printed pamphlets on the molecular structure of dynamite, knowledge that would soon be used against the Sultan's own gendarmes. The Hijaz Railway was his grandest gamble, a single track of German steel laid from Damascus to Medina, 1,300 kilometers through basalt desert, financed by subscriptions from Muslims in India, Java, and the Crimea. Every rivet was stamped with the Sultan's tugra, every station designed like a miniature mosque, its arches echoing the dome of the rock. When the first locomotive steamed into Medina in 1908, pilgrims wept, believing the steel spine would bind the Islamic world to the caliph forever. But the railway also carried German officers, Krupp field guns, and rumored cases of Morse rifles addressed to tribal sheikhs whose loyalty was purchased with gold sovereigns stamped with Quranic verses. The Bedouin, whose camel caravans lost their monopoly, began to blow up bridges. The first sabotage occurred at Muderj in 1909, a charge of dynamite laid beneath the sleepers by a boy who had learned chemistry in the Sultan's own school. The empire had taught its subjects how to destroy the very links that bound them. In Macedonia, the last European province, three nationalisms fought beneath the same crescent moon. Bulgarian Karmatagis blew up Ottoman post offices, Greek Andarts ambushed tax collectors, Serbian Chetniks left severed heads in village squares as calling cards. European consuls sent vivid dispatches. The countryside is a chessboard where every peasant is a pawn that changes color after dark. The great powers imposed reform, a gendarmerie officered by Italian carabinieri, tax collection supervised by Austro-Hungarian officials, and a railway, Salonika to Monastir, built by a French company whose shareholders included the Ottoman debt administration. The train schedule was printed in 5 languages. Conductors spoke 7. In the first-class carriage, a Muslim bey sipped raki across from a Bulgarian merchant reading a Sofia newspaper. In third, a Greek priest argued theology with an Armenian revolutionary carrying a bomb in a violin case. The train itself was a microcosm of the empire, hurtling toward a station no one could yet see, its brakes controlled by creditors in Paris, and its fuel paid for by interest on loans the Sultan could never repay. The Young Turk Revolution erupted in 1908 among the very cadets Abdul Hamid had sent to Europe. On the night of 3 July, Major Ahmed Niazi marched his battalion from Risne into the Macedonian hills, proclaiming that the Constitution of 1876, suspended 30 years ago, is the only legitimate law. The Sultan, isolated in Yildiz, discovered that his telegraph lines had been cut by junior officers who had learned their trade in his military academies. Within 3 weeks, Abdul Hamid capitulated, restoring the constitution and calling elections. Crowds in Istanbul tore down the censor's shutters, waving newspapers printed in Arabic, Turkish, Greek, and Armenian, all bearing the same headline, Hurriyet, liberty. The Balkans answered with war. Bulgaria declared full independence. Austria-Hungary annexed Bosnia. Crete announced union with Greece. The empire that had marched into Europe 6 centuries earlier now retreated on every front. In April 1909, reactionary soldiers and theology students rose in the capital, crying Sharia for the Sultan. They seized the parliament, shot deputies in the gardens, and proclaimed Abdul Hamid restored to absolute power. 3 days later, the Action Army, Macedonian troops loyal to the constitution, entered Istanbul, shelled the mutinous barracks, and deposed the Sultan. Abdul Hamid was sent into gilded exile at Salonika, the same city where his railway car now stood in a museum, its velvet seats moth-eaten, its windows cracked by the stones of children who no longer feared the caliph's shadow. The empire was now ruled by a committee, initially a secret circle of officers, soon the Committee of Union and Progress, CUP, whose headquarters on Nur-i-Osmani Street buzzed with typewriters and cigarette smoke. They spoke of Ottomanism, a civic identity that would bind Muslim, Christian, and Jew into a single nation, loyal not to millet, but to the red flag with its white crescent and star. But the Balkan Wars of 1912-13 shattered the dream. Bulgaria, Serbia, Greece, and Montenegro attacked simultaneously. The Ottoman army, trained by German officers but starved of artillery, retreated to the very gates of Istanbul. Edirne, former capital, still guarded by Roman walls, fell to the Bulgarians. 200,000 Muslim refugees fled toward the Bosporus, their carts creaking with carpets, copper pots, and grandmothers who refused to abandon the graves of saints. The Salonika Railway carried them west to east, the reverse of the caravans that had once carried Islam into Europe. In London, diplomats drew new lines. The empire lost 83% of its European territory and 69% of its European population in 2 years. The Young Turks, once revolutionaries, became administrators of defeat. They turned inward, toward Anatolia, toward the Muslim majority that remained. Ottomanism gave way to Turkism. The Arabic script would soon be questioned. The Armenian merchant mistrusted. The Greek professor advised to keep his valise packed. The empire had entered the 20th century not as a bridge between continents, but as a lifeboat taking on water, its crew debating which passengers to throw overboard to keep the crescent afloat. The lifeboat never found safe harbor. On 28 June 1914, the pistol shots at Sarajevo echoed along the marble corridors of the Sublime Port like the first crack of a dam about to burst. Gavrilo Princip's bullets killed an Austrian archduke, but they also punctured the delicate membrane that had kept the Ottoman Empire from the European alliance system. The young Turk triumvirs, Enver, Talat, and Semel, gathered that night under the gas lamps of the CUP headquarters, maps spread across a table still scarred by coffee rings from the Balkan War councils. They spoke in whispers, yet the words were freighted with the weight of centuries: alliance, neutrality, survival. Russia wanted the Straits. Britain wanted to deny Russia. Germany wanted a jihad that would ignite the Muslim colonies of its enemies. The Ottomans, bankrupt and bleeding, held one card: geography. Enver Pasha, 32, handsome in the way that photographs lie, his waxed mustache curled like scimitars, argued for Berlin, German officers, German guns, German gold. Talat, the former telegraph clerk who understood wires better than warfare, counted the arithmetic of loans. 150 million marks would postpone default until the harvest. Semel, the naval minister who had watched the fleet rot at anchor since the Balkan defeat, dreamed of a surprise sortie that might reclaim the Aegean. At dawn, they telegraphed Berlin, "If you guarantee our borders and advance 5 million gold liras, we will light a fire in the Caucasus that will keep Russia from your eastern front." The Kaiser, ecstatic at the prospect of Muslims rising in India and Egypt, replied within hours, "The coming struggle will be the jihad of the 20th century." The Ottoman Empire entered the war on the side of the Central Powers, not because it was strong, but because it had no strength left to stay neutral. The first shots were fired at sea. On 29 October 1914, the battlecruiser Goeben, renamed Java's Sultan Selim, its German crew wearing fezzes over their kepis, steamed out of the Dardanelles and shelled the Russian ports of Odessa, Sevastopol, and Novorossiysk. The guns that had been forged in Krupp's Essen works now thundered beneath a crescent flag, their shells inscribed with Quranic verses in Gothic script. The Black Sea, calm since the days of the Crimean War, became an Ottoman lake again, briefly. In Istanbul, crowds knelt on the quayside as the returning warship tied up. Imams proclaimed that the German-built vessel was a gift from Allah to the Caliph. In Petrograd, the Tsar ordered the Caucasus army to advance. In London, the Royal Navy sealed the Dardanelles with mines and searchlights that swept the Narrows like the eyes of Argus. The Ottoman Empire, which had once straddled continents, found itself blockaded within them. On land, the war divided the empire into 4 bleeding fronts. In the Caucasus, Enver led 90,000 men across the Alahuekba Mountains in December 1914, dreaming of a triumphal entry into Tiflis. The troops wore summer uniforms. The temperature fell to -30. Horses froze standing up, their breath turning to ice that locked jaws open. At Sarikamish, Russian machine guns waited in the mist. 60,000 Ottoman soldiers died, many frozen stiff where they knelt to pray. Enver returned to Istanbul blaming Armenian treachery, the first note in a dirge that would end in genocide. In Mesopotamia, British Indian divisions sailed up the Shat al-Arab, their sepoys bewildered by the heat that turned rifle barrels too hot to touch. They took Basra, advanced to Kut al-Amara, and there, in December 1915, an Ottoman army under the besieging genius of Colonel Nurettin and later Marshal von der Goltz surrounded 8,000 British and 3,000 Indian troops. For 147 days, Kut starved. General Townshend ate his polo ponies, then his messenger dogs. When surrender came on 29 April 1916, it was the largest British capitulation since Yorktown. The prisoners were marched north. Those who survived remembered the Tigris flowing between banks of reeds where herons stood like white-robed judges. In the Sinai, Semel Pasha dreamed of capturing the Suez Canal and inciting an Egyptian uprising. Twice 1915 and 1916. His columns crossed the desert guided by German pilots in Drachen balloons that cast camel shadows like black spiders on the sand. Both times the British, forewarned by aerial reconnaissance and Bedouin loyal to London's gold, repelled them at the canal's edge. The Sinai became a moonscape of abandoned wells and sun-bleached bones. Australian light horsemen sang Waltzing Matilda as they burned the crops of villages that had fed the Ottoman advance. In Gallipoli, the empire achieved its most mythic victory. When the British and French fleet failed to force the Dardanelles, they landed 75,000 men on the peninsula on 25 April 1915. The Ottoman Fifth Army, commanded by a German general but led at the sharp end by Mustafa Kemal, a 34-year-old colonel who told his men, "I do not order you to attack, I order you to die," held the ridges. For 8 months, the trenches crawled with lice and legend, Simpson and his donkey, the terrible few of Anzac Cove, the Ottoman soldier who threw dates to his enemies between bombardments. When the Allies evacuated in January 1916, they left behind 44,000 dead. The Ottomans had lost 87,000, but the Crescent still flew over the Narrows. Gallipoli became the empire's Iliad, a tale told in every village, yet the victory bled the best of a generation into soil that would within a decade be foreign. While the fronts consumed men, the interior consumed trust. In 1915, the Russian advance in the Caucasus triggered Ottoman fears of an Armenian fifth column. On 24 April, hundreds of Armenian intellectuals in Istanbul were arrested, marched to the railway station at Circasi, and sent east in cattle cars. What followed was not deportation, but destruction. Across Anatolia, Armenian villages were surrounded at dawn. Men were separated from women, shot in ravines, or drafted into labor battalions that quarried stone until they dropped. Women and children were driven south toward the Syrian desert, their columns stretched like black ribbons across the high plateau. German missionaries recorded the way stations, a church at Kangaroo Lake, where the altar was used as a chopping block, a well at Ras Al Ain stuffed so thick with bodies that the water rose red. Estimates range from 600,000 to 1.5 million dead. The word genocide would be coined later, but the reality was already complete. The empire, founded on the accommodation of millets, had annihilated one. When the war ended, the Armenian heartland was a landscape of roofless churches and mulberry trees growing through the bones of the faithful. The young Turks, who had promised liberty, had instead delivered the empire's darkest chapter. By 1918, the fronts collapsed like dominoes. In Palestine, General Allenby, mounted on a horse that had once belonged to the Duke of Wellington, broke through at Beersheba in October 1917. Australian cavalry galloped across the desert so fast their horses died of thirst. Jerusalem fell without a shot fired on 9 December. Allenby dismounted and entered the old city on foot, a gesture of humility calculated for the cameras. In Mesopotamia, General Maud took Baghdad in March 1917, issuing a proclamation in Arabic, Turkish, and English. Our armies do not come as conquerors but as liberators. 9 months later, Maud died of cholera. His grave in Baghdad became a shrine for Indian Muslims who prayed for the empire that had freed them from the caliph. In Syria, the Arab revolt, fueled by British gold and the promises of T. E. Lawrence, cut the Hejaz Railway. Ottoman garrisons, isolated in blockhouses of German concrete, surrendered to Bedouin who rode into Damascus in September 1918 behind the green banner of the Sharif. The empire that had once ruled from Algiers to the Persian Gulf now held only the Anatolian plateau and a strip of Thrace. On 30 October 1918, the Ottoman delegation boarded the British battleship HMS Agamemnon, anchored in Mudrose Harbour beneath the cliffs of Lemnos. The deck was scrubbed white, the officers in dress whites. The Ottomans wore threadbare uniforms, their fezzes dented by the journey from Constantinople. The armistice terms were read, the straits to be occupied, the army demobilized, the fleet surrendered, and the Allies free to occupy any strategic point in case of disorder. The Ottoman delegates signed, their pens scratching like nails on a coffin lid. In Istanbul, church bells rang for the first time in 4 centuries. Greek flags appeared on houses in Fana. French officers strolled the grand Rue de Pira, ordering coffee in cafes where waiters now spoke French without accent. The Sultan, maimed VI, remained in Topkapi, a prisoner of his own palace, watching Allied warships anchor beneath the windows where his ancestors had launched fleets to conquer Rhodes. The partition began before the ink dried. On 18 May 1919, Greek troops landed at Smyrna, welcomed by Orthodox crowds waving blue and white flags sewn from bed sheets. Within days, Turkish civilians were massacred. The Greek metropolitan blessed the troops from a balcony draped with a giant portrait of Venizelos. In the east, Armenian volunteers advanced with the French army into Cilicia, hoping to create a homeland from the ashes. Italian forces occupied Antalya, British troops held Constantinople, and French colonial divisions marched into the Hatay. The Treaty of Sevres, signed on 10 August 1920, carved Anatolia into zones, a Greek zone around Smyrna, an Armenian state in the east, an autonomous Kurdistan, French and Italian spheres of influence, and an international straits zone where no Turkish soldier could tread. The empire was reduced to a rump, a vassal state, whose sovereignty existed only on paper stamped by the League of Nations. European cartoonists drew the Ottoman state as a Turkey, headless, featherless, ready for carving. Yet the empire had one soldier left. Mustafa Kemal, the hero of Gallipoli, landed at Samsun on 19 May 1919 on the steamer Bandırma, his orders to disband the remaining Ottoman forces. Instead, he convened congresses at Erzurum and Sivas, declaring that the independence of the nation will be saved by the determination and resolution of the people itself. The Sultan, desperate to preserve his throne, condemned him. The Allies, preoccupied with punishing Germany, underestimated him. Kemal rallied the remnants of the Ottoman army, armed villagers with weapons hidden from Allied inspectors, and formed the Grand National Assembly in Ankara, a new capital on the Anatolian plateau. The War of Independence lasted 3 years, battles at İnönü, Sakarya, and finally Dumlupinar, where the Greek army was shattered in August 1922. On 9 September, Kemal entered Smyrna on a white horse. 4 days later, the city burned. Whether by Turkish arson or Greek retreat, the flames erased the cosmopolitan port where Turks, Greeks, Jews, and Armenians had traded for centuries. When the smoke cleared, 30,000 were dead, and the Greek presence in Anatolia, 3 millennia old, was finished. On 24 July 1923, the Treaty of Lausanne replaced Sevres. The new Turkish state recognized the loss of the Arab provinces, the Straits demilitarized, and the Greek-Turkish population exchange, 1.2 million Orthodox Christians for 500,000 Muslims, a forced migration sanctified by the signature of statesmen in Swiss suits. On 29 October 1923, the Grand National Assembly proclaimed the Republic of Turkey. On 3 March 1924, it abolished the Caliphate. The last Ottoman Sultan, Mehmet VI, slipped away from Dolmabahce Palace on a British warship, his luggage searched by customs officers who found only a carpet and a copy of the Quran. The dynasty that had ruled for 624 years ended not with a siege but with a passport. The empire had fallen, its map reduced to Anatolia and a sliver of Thrace, its language Latinized, its fezes banned, its future entrusted to a soldier who declared, "The Ottoman dynasty is now in the dustbin of history." Yet the dust refused to settle. In Damascus, Baghdad, Jerusalem, and Sarajevo, the echo of Ottoman centuries lingered in the call to prayer, the coffee grounds at the bottom of a cup, the arch of a bridge built by Sinan. The empire was gone, but its shadow, long crescent-shaped, still falls across 3 continents, a reminder that history is never erased, only overwritten, like parchment scraped clean for a new surah. The shadow did not fade. It shifted, lengthened, and sometimes returned as silhouette. On the night the Caliphate was abolished, 3 March 1924, lamps were extinguished in every mosque of the old imperial capital, but the Bosporus itself refused the darkness. Searchlights from foreign warships swept the strait like memory, probing a wound. In the coffee houses of Aleppo, men argued whether the silence from the minaret of the Ume, ad mosque, was mourning or relief. In Sarajevo, a widow wrapped her fez wearing grandfather's headgear in newspaper and buried it beneath the plum tree, the fruit that summer tasted, she said, of rust and ink. The Ottoman dynasty had stepped off the world stage, yet the stage kept its shape. Borders drawn by Lausanne still looked, from the air, like the outline of a horseman's boot first stamped by Osman in the 13th century dust. Ankara, 1924, a plateau town of single-story houses and wolf-track streets suddenly roared with the hammer of new ministries. Mustafa Kemal, now Atatürk, Father Turk, walked the construction sites at dawn, coat collar turned up against the steppe wind, measuring the future with the stride of a former artillery captain who knew that every centimeter of ground had to be contested twice, once with guns, once with ideas. The Language Reform Commission met in a requisitioned railway car. Its members, sleepless from lexicographical quarrels, drank cognac from tea glasses while debating whether the word for future should be jelisek, what is coming, or a neologism ripped from the root, to become. They chose jelisek, but the argument itself was the point. A people who had once ordered time by the 5 daily prayers were now commanded to order it by clocks whose numerals were changed overnight from Arabic to Latin. The call to prayer continued in Arabic, by law, but the imams were required to pass Turkish language exams. Failure meant reassignment to a village without electricity, where the only book was the Quran and the only newspaper was the wind. Across the former provinces, the imperial grammar persisted in negative space. In Baghdad, the railway station built by the Germans for the Berlin to Basra Express still bore the tugra of maimed V above its ticket window, but the rails ended at a rusted buffer stop, guarded by a British corporal who had never heard of the Hejaz line. In Jerusalem, the Ottoman post office on Jaffa Road had become a Barclays branch. Clerks counted Palestinian pounds beneath a ceiling where stucco rosettes once framed the Sultan's monogram. In Skopje, the clock tower donated by Suleiman the Magnificent kept Ottoman time, 12 hours from sunset, while the city's new Serbian municipality reset it to Central European, so that for years the hour hand pointed 2 different dials at once, a temporal schizophrenia no Balkan spring could heal. Yet the greatest continuity was human. Mehmet Effendi, former court calligrapher to Abdul Hamid, found employment in 1926 painting sharp signs in Bearglue. Each dawn he mixed ultramarine with a drop of vinegar, whispering Bismillah, as he had in the palace workshop, though the words now advertised Singer sewing machines. When asked why he still drew the crescent with 3 strokes instead of the Republic's 2, he replied, "The 3rd stroke is the one that remembers." Memory, like ink, bleeds even when the paper is burned. Syria under French mandate, the High Commissioner, a Breton aristocrat with a monocle and a copy of Marshal Lyautey's Moroccan memoirs, arrived in Damascus determined to erase the Ottoman past by architecture. He widened the Souk streets into boulevards, planted eucalyptus where caravans once unloaded, and renamed the main square after General Giraud. But the stonemasons he employed were the sons of men who had carved the calligraphy on the Ottoman railway station, and they cut the new French street signs with the same curved chisel strokes, so that even Rue Clemenceau carried, to the educated eye, the ghost of Thulath's script. Beneath the paving stones, the sewage system, laid out by Sinan's apprentices in the 16th century, still carried rainwater to the Barada River. Every spring flood lifted a century of debris and deposited, on the doorsteps of new cafes, Ottoman coins fused with French bottle caps, archaeological commentary no archaeologist had requested. In Cairo, King Fuad, descendant of maimed Ali, Albanian adventurer turned Khedive, held court in Abdin Palace where chandeliers once lit by Ottoman embassies now sparkled under British advisors. His ministers wore frock coats, but the court musicians still played the Husseini makam before dinner, a mode banned in Ankara as feudal. Egyptian nationalists denounced the monarchy as a colonial puppet. Yet when they drafted their 1923 constitution, They kept the Ottoman article that required the ruler to be male and Muslim, because no one could imagine Egypt without the faint scent of the caliphate lingering in its constitutional linen. The last Ottoman princess to visit Cairo, Duru-Shayvar, granddaughter of Abdul Hamid, arrived in 1931 with a trunks of silk kaftans and a gramophone that played pre-war tangos. At a charity ball for Muslim orphans, she danced with the young Nasser, then a cadet in patent leather shoes too large for him. 30 years later, when Nasser nationalized the Suez Canal, he sent her a private apology, acknowledging that the company's first shares had been printed on paper water marked with her great-grandfather's tugra. The princess replied that history was a palimpsest. Scrape away one inscription and you find another, but the watermark remains. Palestine, 1936. The Great Arab Revolt against British rule and Zionist immigration began with a general strike in Jaffa. The strike committee met in the khan of an Ottoman caravanserai whose stones had sheltered pilgrims riding to Mecca in the age of Suleiman. They drank coffee from brass pots stamped Constantinople 1892, and their chairman, a schoolteacher from Hebron, opened each session by reading telegrams of support in the florid Ottoman Turkish he had learned from his father, though none of the younger militants understood a word. When British planes bombed the old city of Jaffa, they hit the aqueduct built by Suleiman's engineers. Water gushed through Crusader cellars and Ottoman vaults alike, as if the past itself were weeping. A Jewish photographer captured the scene, Arab boys filling tin cans from a broken pipe that once fed the fountains of Abdul Hamid's mosque. The negative survives, labeled in 3 languages, Turkish, Arabic, Hebrew, proof that even catastrophe can be multilingual. Iraq after 1958, the Hashemite monarchy, installed by the British from the same family that had led the Arab Revolt, was overthrown by officers who met in a railway carriage once used by Ottoman staff during the Mesopotamian campaign. They swore the coup oath with one hand on a Quran printed in Istanbul in 1918, its margins still bearing penciled troop movements in German Gothic script. When they proclaimed the Republic from the balcony of the Royal Diwan, the microphone crackled with feedback that sounded, to the older listeners, like the muezzin's call distorted by distance. The new president, Colonel Abd al-Karim Qasim, kept on his desk a brass inkstand looted from the Ottoman seraglio in Baghdad. He used it to sign the law nationalizing the Iraq Petroleum Company, dipping his pen in the same well that had once inked decrees exempting Kurdish tribes from military service. After his execution in 1963, the inkstand vanished into a Ba'ath Party storeroom, reappearing only in 2003 when an American soldier posted it on eBay with the caption "Cool Arab thing." No idea what it says. It sold for $127.50 to a collector in Izmir who recognized the tugra and hung it above his mantelpiece, completing a circle of exile and return that no historian had planned. Bosnia, 1992. As Yugoslavia disintegrated, the Ottoman bridge at Mostar, built by Sinan's pupil Mimar Hayreddin in 1566, became a sniper's corridor. Croatian guns shelled it from the west, Serbian artillery from the east. The stones, held together by iron cramps forged from Ottoman cannonballs, shuddered but held. When it finally collapsed on 9 November 1993, the world watched in slow-motion horror. The arch lingered mid-air for a heartbeat, then folded into the Neretva like a man kneeling for prayer. The splash sent up a plume of white doves that had nested in the parapet, Journalists wrote that the birds carried away the soul of coexistence. Reconstruction began in 2001, stone by stone, using medieval techniques funded by UNESCO and Turkish donations. The new bridge is identical to the old, except for a discrete steel core that engineers insist is non-obtrusive. Tourists now pose for selfies on its polished keystone, unaware that the mortar contains fragments of the original, ground up and relaid like memory re-remembered. Turkey itself, republican and resolute, could not fully cauterize the Ottoman past. In the 1950s, state radio banned Ottoman classical music as feudal, but black market tapes circulated in Beyoğlu basements where university students, drunk on raki and existentialism, listened to the Ney's lament and wept for an empire they had never known. The military coups of 1960 and 1980 outlawed references to the caliphate, yet every year on the night of Regaip, the Ottoman beginning of the holy season, old women in Üsküdar still light candles beneath framed calligraphy of the Sultan's name, whispering prayers for a grandson's military exam, as if the shadow of authority might intercede where the Republic's bureaucracy could not. When the AK Party came to power in 2002, its leaders spoke of New Turkey, but restored Ottoman language classes, rebuilt barracks in the style of Abdülhamid, and named the third Bosporus Bridge after Yava's Sultan Selim, the conqueror of the Caliphate's heartlands. Critics accused them of nostalgia. Supporters replied that identity is a coat you cannot throw off simply because the weather changes. The diaspora carried the empire in suitcases. In Berlin's Kreuzberg, Turkish grandfathers play backgammon in cafes whose walls display yellowed ferry tickets from the Golden Horn, dated 1963. They argue over whether the coffee should be Greek or Turkish, unaware that both names are post-Ottoman inventions. In Melbourne, an Armenian grandmother teaches her granddaughter to make baklava using a recipe her own grandmother wrote in Ottoman Turkish written in Armenian script. A linguistic palimpsest, edible only at Christmas. In Rio de Janeiro, a synagogue built by Syrian Jews expelled from Aleppo in 1948 keeps a silver Torah case donated by Sua Excelência o Grau Vizier Mehmed Pasha, 1877, a relic that survived because a refugee sewed it inside a mattress during the Atlantic crossing. The rabbi, Sephardic and Brazilian, chants in Hebrew, but ends the service with a Ladino hymn whose chorus, Adio Querida Yemivo, sounds uncannily like the Turkish Elveda, Sevgili, farewell to a beloved whose face is already memory. Digital age. In 2020, a teenager in Detroit uploads to TikTok a 15-second clip of her self-lip syncing to an Ottoman military march remixed with trap beats. The video, captioned Vibe 1853 Energy, receives 2.3 million likes. Historians complain of historical illiteracy. The teenager responds that the empire is a mood, not a syllabus. She has never heard of the siege of Vienna, but the rhythm of the Nacker drums syncs perfectly with the bass drop, and in that syncopation the past becomes present, not as knowledge but as sensation. The comments section fills with flag emojis. Turkey, Albania, Bosnia, Lebanon, Palestine, Israel, each claiming the beat, none owning it, all dancing to a metronome that once timed the march of Janissaries toward Belgrade. The Ottoman Empire ended, yet it did not conclude. Like the looping arabesques that decorate its mosques, the pattern repeats, now as geopolitics. Turkey's troops in Syria, its drones in Libya, its pipelines beneath the Black Sea, now as consumer kitsch. Ottoman-patterned yoga mats, rose-scented cologne sold in bottles shaped like minarets, now as the quiet persistence of shared genes. An Egyptian farmer's green eyes, a Bosnian policeman's hooked nose, a Greek fisherman's ability to curse in Turkish when the nets come up empty. The empire survives as atmosphere, as afterglow, as the third stroke of the calligrapher's pen that remembers what the other two have written and erased. History books close, but the watermark remains, faint yet indelible, waiting for the next reader to hold the page up to the light.